Hello and welcome to our webinar entitled Clinical Trial Diversity, an Effective Trust Framework for Engaging and Recruiting Communities of Color. My name is Dale Smith, and I have the pleasure of serving as the co-founder and CEO of Acclinate. And I welcome you from our company headquarters in Birmingham, Alabama. And joining me is Dr. Camille Pope, our Chief Medical Lead, and Dr. Pope is joining us from our Washington, D.C. office. We have a wide range of individuals who we know are tuning into this webinar. We want to first thank you for taking time to join us. And we know we have individuals here representing everything from pharmaceutical companies sponsoring actual trials to CROs to decentralized clinical trial companies and even sites and patient advocacy organizations. So again, thank you for taking time out of your day for this webinar. And during the course of the hour, you're going to kind of hear from us and learn about what we call an affective trust framework for effective engagement in recruiting of communities of color. And we're gonna use that term intentional when we say affective, and that starts with an A. And we're gonna talk to you about that concept in a little bit more. And so we'll spend a few minutes up front just telling you a little bit about Acclinate as a company, but then we will shortly jump into the framework discussion. So if you have any questions along the way, Camille and I welcome them. We love lively debate. We have a member of our team, Jason Rupp, who's here moderating the chat. So please feel free to put your comments and your questions in the chat. We will answer the questions as we can along the way, but we will also make sure that we save time at the end of the webinar to be able to have a Q&A as appropriate. So let's go ahead and get into the next slide. So we created Acclinate about 2 years ago with a single vision and mission in mind. And that was about health equity through inclusive research. We wanted to be sure that medications, pharmaceuticals that people use every day had the same level of efficacy for people, no matter their race or their ethnicity. And so we knew this is a longstanding issue in the industry. And so we set out as a single mission to help pharmaceutical companies and healthcare organizations access and engage communities of color so that the research is more inclusive. And we do that through an integration of culture and technology. But I want to highlight something that we are very intentional about. What you see here is members of the Acclinate team. And from the very beginning with our company, we've been very intentional about building a company with diversity in mind. And so this picture, I think, illustrates much of this, that if we're going to be talking about the importance of communities of color, racial and ethnic diversity, it's important that we understand lived experiences that go along with that discussion. And so, again, we are intentional about this, and we would encourage anyone who's out there working with partners and providers to evaluate and assess that same level of intentionality as it relates to their ability to understand lived experiences, particularly with this topic that we're talking about. So that's my spiel about Acclinate, and we're going to jump into the framework at this point. Camille?
Thank you, Dale. So I would first like to level set all of us on the fact that communities of color make up almost 50% of the US population. And we, as a woman of color, often have a higher disease burden for specific diseases, especially chronic illnesses and certain types of cancer compared to the general population. Yet we often represent less than 5% of clinical trial participants. And so why is this important? Well, it's important because without clinical trial diversity, we don't know if new drugs work the same for different populations. Some drugs might be more or less efficacious or have more or less side effects based on our genetic makeup or our ancestral background. And I'll give an example that we talk about at Acclinate a lot with albuterol. So many of you know albuterol is a commonly used asthma medication. It's an inhaler. And a study from 2018 out of UCSF found that African-American and Puerto Rican children had less of a response to albuterol because of a genetic variant that was more prevalent in these children compared to children who were of Mexican descent or of European descent. And the thought is that that might even be contributing to the reason why Black and Puerto Rican children die at 4 to 5 times the rate from asthma compared to the general population. For those of you who are in oncology on the call, I spent many years in oncology. You know about BRCA gene mutations, and there are certain ethnicities and patients with certain backgrounds who are more likely to have a BRCA gene mutation. And so when we are developing targeted therapies as a research sponsor, if we're not inclusive of all of the different races and ethnicities and people with different backgrounds who have different genetic variations or variations in metabolism or pharmacokinetics, we are at risk of not understanding how well the drug works in everyone. And this slide just reiterates that fact. So this is from the 2020 FDA Drug Snapshot, and it's showing that out of the 32,000 patients who were enrolled in clinical trials, label-enabling clinical trials in 2020, you can see that when it comes to communities of color, those percentages are still less than what we see compared to the representative general population for those representative of those communities of color in the general population. And not only is clinical trial diversity just the right thing to do for people and for patients, but regulatory authorities like the FDA are also starting to take notice of the lack of clinical trial diversity and recommending that research sponsors make a change. And so there was actually an FDA guidance that recently was issued just a couple of weeks ago. It was a draft guidance for a diversity plan that the FDA is recommending research sponsors submit around race and ethnicity and explaining what is your diversity plan from a research perspective when you're enrolling clinical trials, and asking research sponsors to submit this information and their plan for recruiting diverse patients prior to the start of pivotal trials that are intended for marketing submissions. And so the key here is that not only is the FDA asking for you to think about this as a research sponsor and to put plans in place, but to do it early in the drug development process before the trial even starts. And so, again, there could potentially be regulatory implications down the line if research sponsors continue to move forward without considering diversity within their studies. And so that being said, we are going to get a bit into the framework. And there are many reasons why communities of color have been historically underrepresented in clinical trials. Everything from social determinants of health to political determinants of health to just general lack of awareness of studies being available. But we know that one of the main drivers is mistrust. Mistrust in the research process, mistrust in the medical system in general. And for many reasons, this mistrust is valid. We know that there have been horrific atrocities committed against communities of color in the biomedical research space in the past. And, those things stay in people's memories and live on in stories, generation through generation. And so we feel that it is absolutely imperative for research sponsors to play an active part in regaining that trust to help encourage communities of color to want to be involved in clinical research. And so before I jump into the definition of trust in the two different types of trust, I'd like to just have you put in the chat, what are some of the things that you're doing in your organization to help increase trust with communities of color when it comes to clinical research? And maybe when we have a bit of a pause or we do a question, Jason can let us know what some of those comments are from those of you on the call. So jumping into the definition of trust, we talk about trust, but what is trust? Well, trust is the willingness of one party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party. So that means if I, Camille, trust you, it means that I'm vulnerable to you. And I'm expecting that you will perform an action that is important to me and that will be beneficial to me, regardless of my ability to monitor or control what you do as the person that I am putting trust in. And this applies to the clinical trial recruitment process because there is an inherent risk when someone is deciding whether or not to participate. And so that's why we feel like trust is really a key component of making sure that we are building trust when we're encouraging communities of color to participate in the clinical research process.
Now,
Go ahead.
I'll do this part, Camille, give you a little bit of a break here. So, we use this term trust, but it's important not only just to know the definition, but to understand that there are different types of trust. And we'll start with this discussion of cognitive trust first, cognitive trust. And that is trust, if you see on the right-hand side here, that's based upon logic, right? It's based upon rationality, competence, information, knowledge, evidence. And that is oftentimes what historically our industry has relied on when it comes to our thinking about trust with communities of color as it relates to clinical trials, right? Let's give them more information. Let's help them understand the process. Let's help them understand protocols. Let's help them understand what they're going to experience when they go through the process. Very important. Don't want to take away from that. But what we hope that you understand from our discussion here is that affective trust, particularly with our communities of color, particularly when, as Camille talked about, this historical mistrust that's deeply rooted in our communities, we have to address this from an affective element. And that is trust that's based upon emotion. And so that is trust that's based upon, as you see here, relationships, human emotions, personal goodwill, genuine concern, and intrinsic value. And the example I will use, which is a real life example, is not too long ago, I had a chronic cough and I wasn't sure what that chronic cough was caused by. So it took me a while. I got a telehealth medicine appointment with my primary care physician. He had about 10 minutes to spend with me. I gave him my symptoms. He asked some questions, and then he gave me a litany of things that it could possibly be. And of course, it ran the gamut from post-long COVID to allergies to all kinds of things. Well, I like to speak to my grandmother on a weekly basis. I call her Big Mama. That's what some people in our community call their grandmother Big Mama. And while we were talking, I was coughing and mentioned about this cough that wouldn't go away. And my grandmother said, put some Vicks on your chest, turn your heater up, wrap up in a blanket and sweat it out. And I remember thinking to myself at that time, I've got my doctor who's trained as a medical professional telling me something that I should do. And I've got my grandmother who love her to death, did not finish high school, who's telling me something else related to my health. And so at that moment, that was an example of this interaction between cognitive trust and affective trust. And what did I end up doing that night? Took out the Vicks, put it on my chest, wrapped up in a blanket, turned the heater on. Did that solve the issue? I'm not saying it did, but it's this demonstration that we really rely on affective trust, because I had no question that example that my grandmother loved me, she cared about me, and she would do nothing intentionally to try to do any harm for me. And I think that's the story we want you to keep in mind as we think about how we engage with these communities of color.
Thank you, Dale.
And so we get into, to kind of continue this discussion, the general premise of this framework is that adequate levels of affective trust must be attained before our communities of color are willing to participate in a clinical trial. And that changes in these trust levels can be mapped, and we have mapped them to different stages of engagement, from pre-readiness to readiness to participation and retention. And the reality is, and we know this from the data, that if affective levels of trust do not reach a certain level, people are not willing to participate and stay engaged and be retained for a trial. And so we're going to talk to you about ways that you can adjust that affective trust levels in order to reach the levels that you need to be successful in your trials.
Thanks, Bill. So going into the objective of the framework, we're going to go deep into the framework and talk about several of the central themes. When we created this, we wanted to lean on the best practices in framework development. We wanted to take empirical evidence and observable data that's already out there, it already exists, related to the importance of recruiting and retaining communities of color. We wanted to use common sense language so that it wouldn't be difficult for those who reviewed the framework to understand. And we wanted to make it generalizable and applicable to many different circumstances. So, this could potentially be applicable to many different clinical trials in different disease states, and maybe even beyond clinical trials, just in general, engaging communities of color around making general healthcare decisions besides just being involved in a clinical trial. And then the last objective that I'll call out is actually the one that's second to last on the side, is around proposing new perspectives on how to do this. I've worked in pharmaceutical industry for many years in the medical affairs space. And so I'm familiar with there are processes and how clinical studies are done within a company. And so what we wanted to do is, take that and encourage research sponsors to apply a new lens, a new perspective, maybe think outside of the box a bit in how you are selecting clinical trial sites and how you are talking to people in different communities, what investigators you're selecting. Think of different things and new things to do that would encourage a more inclusive environment when it comes to clinical research. And so how did we do it? Well, we compiled evidence from a lot of different sources. We reviewed industry best practices in literature. We talked to subject matter experts, and I will say a word there for a second around subject matter experts. You have your traditional subject matter experts. So those of us who may have PhDs, PharmDs, physicians, or who have studied social determinants of health and inclusion and diversity in this landscape for a long time. But then we also have to remember that people are subject matter experts in their own experiences. And so we can't discount that, right? If someone says, I experienced this when I had this particular illness, or I experienced this while being involved in a clinical trial, well, that's just as relevant as the traditional experience that someone brings to the table. We also held exploratory focus groups and conducted surveys as part of different pilot projects that we've worked on over the last several years. And we also got insight from many of you on the call who work in industry in the areas of clinical development, clinical operations, medical affairs, and research in general. And so now what I'm about to do is talk about our 3 central themes that make up our framework, and some of the different concepts and components that align with those different themes. The 3 different themes are inclusive study design, effective community engagement, spelled with an A, so affective community engagement, and trust enabling technology. So first, starting off with inclusive study design. The concept that we'd like to talk about on this slide is participant selection, and really encouraging research sponsors to think about ways they can broaden eligibility criteria and avoid unnecessary exclusion criteria that could prohibit communities of color, really just any patients, but particularly communities of color, from being involved in a clinical study, and making sure that you're not writing them out of the protocol before the study even starts. And we know that as we go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 clinical trials within the drug development process, we learn more and more and more about a drug. We learn about its pharmacokinetics. We learn about drug-drug interactions. And there may have been inclusion and exclusion criteria that were applicable in the phase 1 studies that might not be applicable in phase 3 as you learn more and more about the characteristics of the drug. And so we encourage research sponsors to think about that. Maybe don't just copy and paste what you had in phase 1, and think about what has been learned as time has gone on throughout the drug development process, and adjust your inclusion and exclusion criteria accordingly. Additionally, there are different types of trial designs that can be considered, such as adaptive trial designs, where as a study is ongoing, you can think about adjusting the patient population based on evidence or efficacy or side effects that you might see, especially as it pertains to folks who maybe have a similar racial, ethnic, or genetic characteristics, or even enrichment strategies. And an example I'll give is maybe in prostate cancer cancer because I worked in prostate cancer for several years. Black men in the US are twice as likely to be diagnosed with prostate cancer and twice as likely to die from advanced prostate cancer. And so when we're thinking about enrolling prostate cancer studies, especially in the metastatic, it makes sense to try to enrich for Black patients in those clinical trials. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to reach that target, right? But think about how you might be able to over-enroll and strive to over-enroll so that the population that you do have at the end of the study is more representative of the general population that will be using the drug. And that's likely to be Black men because they're diagnosed twice as much and die twice as frequently compared to the general population from that disease state. Another concept to think about when it comes to inclusive study design is targeted site selection. And really, this is all about meeting people where they already receive care. And in terms of thinking about new perspectives and thinking outside of the box, the sites where people are receiving their care may not be the sites that as research sponsors you're used to engaging and selecting for clinical trials. And so it might take some additional effort or investment or analysis to understand, besides that tried and true big research site in that big city that you use all the time, what other community health centers or community sites could potentially be leveraged for your clinical trial, whether it's as a referral site, so that that site refers to the large research site, or you invest in that community site and build it up so it can be a site on its own. Site selection should occur in geographic areas where there's racial and ethnic diversity and easy accessibility for the patients who live in that community to get to the trial site. Database analysis, I talked about that previously, of each site's local community. So really understanding around the sites that you're selecting, who lives there, who lives in the neighborhood, and are those going to be folks who could potentially be clinical trial participants when the study kicks off. Yeah. And then I also have noted on here considerations for decentralized clinical trials. I know Del has some comments there, so I'll turn it over to him for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Camille. Yeah, we know decentralized clinical trials is definitely a movement that's here. It was ushered in and advanced much with the COVID vaccine research, and it's not going away anytime soon. And the great thing about decentralized clinical trials, of course, is that you start to remove some of the geographic barriers and limitations on where you could run these trials. But the reason all these things that Camille is talking about in terms of protocol and study selection and site selection is important because they all fundamentally tie into the framework. And you know what we will say, just because you can bring a trial to somebody's front door and you can even bring it into their house, there still has to be a level of trust for them to open the door and to let you in. And so decentralized trials, while we think it's going to move the needle in terms of opening up trial opportunities to folks that otherwise had not been aware or it was inaccessible because of access issues, it is still just as important for us to have this discussion about affective trust and building affective trust in those areas. And the other thing I'll say about target site location as well too, is that we've come to find out that you have to drill in down to a zip code level sometimes for these targeted site locations. Just to say, I'm going to run my trial in Atlanta, or just to say DC or Philly is not enough, because as we all know from these communities, there's a lot of heterogeneity in these communities. And so just planting your site in a section of Philly may not be the proper or the best physical location for that metro area. And sometimes that's down to a matter of blocks. And are you on this side of the railroad tracks, or are you on the other side of the railroad tracks? And that is the reality that I think Camille is trying to talk to us about how significant site selection is in the process.
Thanks, Del. All right, so moving on to our second central theme. This is personally my favorite, affective community engagement. And we believe that a comprehensive community engagement strategy and affective community engagement strategy involves everybody in the community members, community leaders, patients, healthcare providers, patient advocates. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can identify who some of those trusted messengers might be. But the comprehensive engagement strategy, it needs to involve everyone, but also be implemented across all aspects of clinical research, even before the study starts. I think of it this way, we all probably have a friend or family member who only comes to us, calls us when they need something, right? They haven't engaged us early. They haven't engaged us, just to see how we're doing. But when they need something, they're calling on us because they have a favor. And we believe that that is not the appropriate way to engage, especially when it comes to recruiting communities of color. You have to engage before you even want something, like to recruit patients in a clinical trial. Show that you care, be in the communities, expressing genuine concern for health and wellness, maybe doing community, screenings and testings, cancer, high blood pressure, but just have that presence. And it should be implemented before the study starts, and it should continue after the study ends. And so it is a continuous and sustained. One of the key aspects that we focus on around effective community engagement, we focus on activation points. And so an activation point is simply an individual or an organization with credibility in a community of color who can serve as a trusted messenger around health and wellness, specific disease states, or the importance of enrolling in a clinical study. And we feel that these activation points are best positioned to induce trust and establish relationships with those who are in the community who may at some point be interested in participating in a clinical trial. And so these trusted messengers should be reflective of cultural norms and community demographics. And we've listed some examples here. It can be, elected officials. It could be healthcare providers. Many patients go to healthcare providers who look like them and share their culture because they feel like that's who understands them the most. So perhaps a healthcare provider could be an activation point. You have historically Black colleges and universities with medical schools and pharmacy schools and HBCU presidents. All of these folks, plus more, can act as trusted messengers when it comes to sharing information around clinical research and just health and wellness and disease state information in general. And if you find that you're having success in accessing and engaging a specific community, there may be an opportunity to scale a clinical trial site there with proper support and investment. So again, thinking about a new perspective when selecting a clinical trial site, after you identified activation points and had some success in a particular community, don't go to that same research site or just only go to that same research site. Go to a new research site and potentially scale within that community of color.
And I'll chime in here, Camille. I'll point to a discussion that I had and something that happened with our co-founder, Tiffany Whitlow, who's actually on the chat here. I like stories, obviously, as you can tell. So at some point, Tiffany came and said, we need to sponsor in this particular community their Little League end of year ceremony. And I'm like, why are we looking to sponsor a Little League ceremony? And what we found and what we were acting on, operationalizing, is the fact that in that community and in really other communities, coaches are significant activation points, not just for the players, but also the families that are connected to them. So the opportunity to be able to get a coach to stand up and say, listen, it's time for us to be educated, engaged, empowered about our health. It's important. People listen. Not only the young people listen, but the parents listen as well. And the young people carry that message to the parents. And so that's an example of really getting into the community, finding the activation points, figuring out ways that you can help, that you can provide value before there's a period of time where you have to ask for something for it to be transactional.
Thanks, Del. That's a great example. And we actually have examples of different activation points that we've identified on this slide. The goal of the slide is not for you to be able to read all of this. It's just giving you, again, examples of, through the different programs we've worked on at Acclinate, the activation points we've identified. So Dell mentioned coaches. I know we have a relationship with different mayors in different cities throughout Alabama and as well as the DC area. It may be partnering with the National Black Nurses Association or partnering with the church. I'll give an example in the DC area. The church that I go to partnered with, pharmaceutical industry, as well as a healthcare organization, a hospital nearby, to run a vaccination clinic in predominantly Black County, where there was a challenge with access to COVID-19 vaccines. So all of these can serve as sample activation points. The next concept we'll talk about when it comes to affective community engagement is cultural communications. And this simply means just having materials that speak to the community that you are trying to reach. That could be culturally sensitive education, culturally sensitive engagement and recruitment flyers, having flyers, videos, any of that is reflective of the community. So, you see in our visual here, if we're trying to reach African Americans, well, have an African American person on the flyer, have the information in a vernacular and a reading level that everyone can understand, and really center the patients and really center the community members, and you'll see on this last bullet point, I think this is really important to highlight that, the communication strategy is going to be unique and different for every activation point. And so you have to be ready for that. You might not be able to do just cookie cutter flyers between Atlanta, DC, Birmingham, and Detroit, right? You have done that database analysis of the community that you're trying to reach. You might have to do some tweaks to make sure that whatever it is that you're communicating and however you're communicating it is really relevant to the community that you're trying to reach.
And Camille, I'd love to have the participants go through a quick exercise. So forget for a minute that you're in a webinar talking about clinical trial diversity. Clear your mind. And I'm going to say some words, and I want you to think about what comes to mind when I say these words. You ready? Here goes. Trial, investigator, consent, protocol. If you think about those terms and you've removed the context of everyday knowledge about clinical trial diversity, these are the same types of vernacular we use when we're talking about our justice system. And for many people in our communities of color, when we hear things like trial and investigator and consent, it does not create a sense of affective trust. And so it is very important, and we take that into account. We think it's important that this isn't just about putting a picture of somebody who looks diverse on a flyer and think that you've achieved the goal of ensuring that you have cultural sensitive communication. It's about finding ways and being understanding of that lived experience to know how the tone, how the thinking and the subconscious works when people see this information. And so there's some terminology in the industry we're not going to be able to change. That's not the ability, but something as simple as maybe using the word study or research study when you can versus the word trial could be a small step in the process. And again, we have to adhere to protocols in the process, but those are things we need to be very, very conscious about as we engage with our communities of color.
That was a great exercise. Thank you, Dell. And so moving into our third and last central theme of our framework, we have trust enabling technology. And we'll start off by talking about digital engagement. But before we talk about digital engagement, I just want to reiterate and call out that we have to go beyond just the digital engagement. I am someone who, I think I mentioned this earlier in the call, I'm a firm believer of boots on the ground efforts. Get into the communities, go into the neighborhoods, meet people, talk to them, ask them about their concerns, get to know them. that is one of the best ways to build affective trust, again, and to show people that you care about their health and well-being, besides just wanting them to be in a clinical trial. And there's a different type of relationship that is built when you meet someone face to face versus through just digital engagement. And so we feel like, you really need to have both. And because it is 2022, and we know that, you can have a very broad reach when it comes to using digital platforms. We do feel that that is a key component of the framework, but I'm also a strong believer that it must be matched with the in the neighborhood efforts as well. But when it does come to digital engagement, there are lots of different channels that you can use: email, text messaging, social media, chatbots. And the content, again, needs to be relevant to the community that you're trying to reach. That can include storytelling videos, testimonials from someone from that particular community who has been in a clinical study, and what their experience has been like. And that might encourage others to want to be in a clinical study as well. The information that is shared should be placed online in a place where communities of color are already engaged. So that might go beyond just, a simple Twitter post. You might actually have to find out, well, are there any healthcare provider influencers on Twitter or Instagram who this specific community, whether it's, Black patients or, Hispanic patients, who they really trust and listen to. And maybe you need to bring that person on board to help you with your disease education and clinical trial awareness efforts. And so patient-facing websites, we list a lot of different options here. And I think the most important point of this last slide, or one of the most important points of this particular slide, is the last bullet. And that's after you have brought awareness to the community, help guide interested persons to the next step. What do you do? Okay, now I know about this disease state. I'm interested in the clinical trial. I might potentially be eligible. What do I do? So it may be providing a website or a phone number or information on a local clinical trial site that community member may be able to go to. So all of this is part of digital engagement.
And as you can tell from the title of the slide in this framework, there is something called trust enabling technology. And if not utilized correctly, technology can actually have the opposite effect. If I have a concern about something with a service provider or with my cell phone provider, and I pick up the phone and I have to dial this 1-800 number, and then I get this bot that's telling me to press this and press that and press this, I'm not creating increased levels of trust with that provider and with that engagement. Maybe if I just needed basic information like a bill balance, I'm okay doing that. But if I have a true concern, I want to speak to someone. And so be very cautious about the type of technology that you deploy to reach people, and ensure that when you're reaching them, that technology is not having the opposite effect, which is reducing the level of affective trust that you have. It may be increasing cognitive trust, but it may actually be decreasing affective trust.
Yeah, that's a great point, Del. Technology can potentially increase disparities when we're trying to actually decrease disparities. And so that is important to keep in mind. And here we actually have an example of our now included community. This is Acclinate's community. It's primarily based on a digital platform, but we also have community members who, aren't necessarily part of our digital platform. And the now included community is our method for educating and engaging diverse populations and empowering them to make health-related decisions. And so, if you join the platform, you'll find lots of folks on there just sharing their experiences. It's a place where minority communities can come to be heard, understood, and informed about their health. So folks are sharing their health-related experiences, but there's also an opportunity for education. So we're providing education on specific disease states. We are providing education on the basic clinical research process to help demystify it a bit. And, this is a community that we have built as Acclinate called Now Included, that is, part of that is application of the framework, right? That trust enabling technology. Del, do you have anything else you'd like to add about Now Included?
Yeah, I would just say that, we're providing this to you as an example, and whether you're leveraging Now Included as your site that you leverage, or whether you try to create your own type of community, again, going back to our vision, we just want to see health equity through inclusive research. And so again, the point of this for us was to share some of our examples that we use, but we would love to speak to anybody who's trying to get more information about how they might build a community that based upon affective trust in the process.
Thanks, Del.
Mhm.
And then the last component around trust enabling technology is around artificial intelligence and machine learning and integrating AI and ML into the clinical research process. And this is Del's expertise. So I am going to allow him to talk about this concept. And Del would love if you would chat a bit about making sure there isn't bias in the AI and ML integration process and when you're speaking to the slide. And he'll also speak about Edict, another example of a platform that we use and that we're integrating into our practices to achieve inclusive research.
Yeah, that probably makes sense that the person that wants to get to boots on the ground and has some concerns about technology will hand that over to me, but that's what makes it such a great team here, and I love it. But absolutely. So, Camille talked to you about trust enabling technologies that are on the front end that your communities are going to interface with and interact with. But there is tremendous opportunity for us to look at moving the needle on this issue of inclusion and research through the use of AI and ML. We know there's a lot of buzz going on right now about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Everybody's using that term, saying it's going to solve all these things. But we specifically know that a really good framework for addressing this issue has to take into account the technologies that allow us to do some very specific things. So the proper application for AI and ML in this particular space that we're talking about will help us learn and understand, for example, when we're seeing certain inclusion exclusion characteristics that are having a negative impact on our sample size and our ability to recruit, we can put some modeling in place that helps us determine that, or either look at data over many, many years to help us determine if there are certain factors that we just from looking at one or two studies can't find. That AI ML technology can be used to help facilitate some of that trust enabling technology to know when is the proper time to communicate with somebody. When have we lost engagement with them, or when is the engagement decreasing? When is the level of affective trust at a certain level that now we would be proper to present that trial to that information versus just sending it to everybody and just hoping that somebody kind of bites on it. So that AI ML technology can utilize that and help with that process. So in addition to that, of course, when it comes to actually matching likely participants with trials, we can use that technology to do that as well too. But I do want to get to the point that Camille talked about before I kind of move away from this piece of it, that we got to be very careful when it comes to what we call algorithmic bias. And that is simply a situation where we take modeling, which is based upon regressions and lots of statistical analysis, but it's based upon data in, and that data in, if it's biased, is going to likely produce data out in terms of insights and actions. And in this particular case, we know that there's correlations that exist between certain socioeconomic levels and people's participation. We clearly know that there's correlations between race and ethnicity and people's participation levels. So we simply took that same data and fed into our platforms. That system, if left to their own, someone said to me the other day, AI and ML is like a young child that's left just to run around and make their own decisions, and you cannot allow it to do that. You have to put some constraints on it. And those constraints that you need to put on your AI ML algorithms is what we would call stewardship. And that is saying we have an intended outcome, and that is to have more people be included in clinical trials and participate. So how can we take this data that's coming in, put the right refinement to our model to ensure that we're not exasperating current issues and only having outcomes that only mimic, if not exasperate outcomes that we were trying to get rid of in the first place. So if anybody's working with providers or working with technology that utilizes AI and ML, one of the things I preach about all the time is to ask that person, what are you doing to ensure that you do not have algorithmic bias in your modeling? And if they can't answer that question, it's worth you digging a little bit further to see if they can come up with a good answer for you.
Thank you, Del.
So Camille mentioned this. And so again, just like we gave an example of Now Included, we'll talk to you. We use a platform called Edict that we've developed, which is our engagement analytics tool, which uses this AI and ML to take all of this work that we're doing, interacting with the community, that's allowing us to do two things: build trust and gather data. And that building trust and gathering data is what allows us to know when is the right time to present a particular trial to an individual. And that is the platform we developed. And so we have something called a participation probability index. And that participation probability index takes these factors and says, if we were going to present a trial to Camille for a particular disease state or issue, what is the likelihood that she would lean in and positively respond to that trial? And that is our use of AI and ML as it equates to trying to ensure that we have health equity through inclusive research.
Thank you, Del.
Mm-hmm.
So as we wrap up the presentation portion of this discussion, we want you to think about some of the key actions that you're going to take as a research sponsor or someone involved in the clinical research process to make research more inclusive and to ensure that you are including communities of color who have been historically underrepresented in the clinical research process, to make sure that they're having an opportunity to be considered for these clinical research opportunities. Some key actions that we've outlined here are just things to keep in mind. Implementing a successful strategy is a multi-step effort. There is no one solution. We didn't talk about just one solution here. We only talked about really one aspect of trust, affective trust, and several solutions that fall under that. But there's so many different things that can be done and many actions that can be taken, and that all really have to work together in order for there to be some movement of the needle in this space. So, we encourage folks not to get discouraged, but do something, right? And know that it's gonna take time. Building trust takes time. Building trust takes time. I say that all the time. Building trust takes time. It's going to take time, and it might take multiple different steps in order for you to see a shift, and that's okay. The other key point on this slide is that the process is continuous. And as I mentioned before, it shouldn't center exclusively on the start or end of a single trial. Start building engagement in communities of color just because you care, right? Just because you want to be there and you want to help improve the health and wellness of, again, maybe not just communities of color, everyone, but we're specifically talking about communities of color on this particular call. And just know that it has to start before you want something, before you want someone to be involved in a clinical trial, right? Having that trust already built and already having those relationships will make it just that much easier potentially for you to encourage those who may have not wanted to get involved, at least consider being involved in the research process when the time comes for you to do your study. And then once the study is over, that engagement should continue. It should go beyond even the time of the clinical trial. And lastly, just to note that the central components from the framework, they have to be understood and implemented correctly. So, taking into account the things that we talked about, making sure there isn't bias in your trust enabling technology. That is just an example. They have to be implemented correctly in order to optimize engagement, participation, and retention. And so
as promised, we wanted to ensure that we had time at the end for questions and answers. And I've been kind of looking at the chat a little bit. Some interesting discussions have been coming on the chat. But Jason, could you maybe help us address some of the most pressing questions or issues that have been brought up in the chat that you've been watching since we've been talking?
Yeah, well, I think so. The first question we have is when we're talking to clients, what kind of questions do you get and what kind of resistance do you get?
I think it's a great question. I think I've seen some comments here that really lean to this answer. And that is the fact that the things that we're talking about, sustained affective trust and engagement with communities, is not the current traditional paradigm. I think the industry right now is understanding that this is probably the only way to do it, But for so long, I think they've tried to figure out shortcuts and ways to get around it. And I think the data would have us show that there's really no shortcut to this. And so everything from the way that protocols are designed without this framework in mind, to how budgeting is tied to and associated at certain levels in the organization downstream that don't really account for this ability to get in early, as Dr. Pope mentioned. I think those are some of the things that we're finding that when we interact with sponsors and clients, that they're trying to figure out. They understand that this framework and this paradigm is what's needed, but they're trying to match it against the current methods and processes and budgeting within the organization.
Yeah, thanks, Del. And I'll chime in here just with some of my personal experience working in industry for many, many years and working in medical affairs. Oftentimes, large phase 3 trials are global studies. And so when you are trying to define diversity in clinical trials, you have companies trying to put that in the context of, okay, well, what does that look like in the US? And then what does that look like in Italy? And what does that look like in the UK? And it could be very different depending on, where those clinical trial sites are located in the world. So here we're talking more from a United States perspective. But if you have a clinical development team or a clinical operations team that is operating at that global level, it can be a challenge for them to think, okay, well, how do I do things differently for the US where we're trying to increase racial and ethnic diversity versus, what I might need to do in the UK or what I need to do in Poland. And so those are some of the challenges that, I've experienced and that I've also seen while at my time at Acclinate, and just research sponsors really needing to think through how do we kind of get beyond that mindset or work within the programming and the processes that we already have so that we can still execute a global study, but address these disparities that exist within the different countries. And within the US, a lot of those disparities are around racial and ethnic diversity, although there are other disparities as well when it comes to, age and gender too. So that's one of the challenges.
Okay, so we have another question. Great one. In your opinion, is it key that the PIs are of the same ethnic background as the patients?
Camille, you want to jump on that one?
I'll jump on that one. I personally don't think so. I think it certainly helps. I'm speaking as my lived experience, from my lived experience as a Black woman, many of my healthcare providers are Black, and I connect with them on a different level than I might connect with someone who doesn't have that same cultural background as me. But that being said, there are a lot of white healthcare providers who care about their Black patients and their Hispanic patients too. You want PIs who are going to care and who are going to understand the importance of enrolling diverse patients that match the epidemiology of the disease state for the trial, right? That's really what's important. You don't want a PI who doesn't care about patients, but only cares about numbers and how many patients I can enroll without offering the trial to everyone. And that doesn't have anything to do with race or ethnicity from a PI perspective. It's all about that awareness of what really needs to be done, and making sure that, biases are checked at the door, and that everybody who walks through the door who could potentially be a clinical trial participant is offered that opportunity.
And I'll add on to that briefly here. We see different sponsors with different strategies as it relates to this. Some strategies are really focused on diversifying PIs, and they believe that's going to be the way to go. Other sponsors are focused on finding diverse healthcare professionals. Others are focused on finding diverse sites. Then you see others that are trying to do more DCT, decentralized clinical trials, as their primary approach. And we don't think there's a silver bullet for this. So, and all these have some level of impact on the issue. But we don't want to get away from the fact that at the end of the day, we're talking about people, individuals having to make a decision, whether it's DCT, whether it's through a physician that they connect with or not from a racial and ethnic background. There has to be a level of trust for them to say yes. And without implementing some element of an affective, sustained trust engagement model, you're not going to get optimal outcomes no matter which of those strategies that you use. And so that's what we really want people to take away from this.
Those are our only 2 questions so far. If anyone's got any last minute questions, we can take them.
Well, while we're waiting on those questions, I do want to say this because I see some of the comments going through. This is not easy work, right? And for those that are in the trenches, that are on this call, who've been fighting this fight for years within your organizations, trying to move the needle and get solutions, it's not easy. And what we want to do is encourage you to know that there is another option, and there is evidence and frameworks that can be applied, whether you apply the entire framework in your organization or you take an element of the framework and you implement it. There are things that we're learning that can be done to address this issue. And so please don't get frustrated. Please don't throw your hands up, because all of us are in this fight, and all of us are trying to ensure that when a drug is on the market, that it is working the same for my big mama as it is for everyone else who it's intended for. And so keep up the work. We would be more than happy to speak with anybody after this call to talk to you about your current strategies that you're doing, to give you suggestions and advice or recommendations. And so we just want to do our part to ensure that we get closer to our mission and our vision. But we really thank you for your time and appreciate the fact that you allow us to share some of our insights and understanding with you.